what is it about monsters, that really pulls us in? Beyond just the scares. Take the werewolf, for instance. This creature, it's been haunting our stories for, well, centuries, changing shape, not just literally, but in how we imagine it. What makes this myth so incredibly enduring, and maybe what does it tell us about ourselves?
That's a great question, or a really great question. And it's basically the heart of our deep dive today. We've gathered quite a stack of sources, actually. Everything from ancient myths and old movie reviews to, modern medical journals, psychological case studies. We're really going to try and explore the werewolf's world from all angles.
Yeah, our mission, if you like, is to guide you through its whole journey, from those ancient origins in mythology through its iconic place in classic horror films, Universal's The Wolfman, 1941, of course, then into psychology with Freud's famous Wolfman case, and even how doctors understand it today as clinical lycanthropy. We really want to unpack how this figure reflects our fears, our desires, maybe even the whole idea of transformation.
Exactly. It's a creature that seems to adapt and evolve right alongside us. It's definitely more than just a simple monster story.
Okay, so let's start with the movies, because that's where a lot of us probably first met the werewolf. Universal's 1941 The Wolfman. It's arguably the big one, right?
Yeah.
But here's something surprising. When it first came out, like 5 days after Pearl Harbor, the reviews were pretty bad.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Variety called it, I think, dubious entertainment at this particular time.
Right.
Which is quite something. And the New York Times, well, they weren't much kinder. One critic said the monster looked less terrifying and not nearly as funny as Mr. Disney's Big Bad Wolf. Ouch. A lot of early critics just dismissed it as, a silly genre film.
Right. And yet, despite that cold shoulder at first, it was a huge hit. Pulled in over $1 million, which was serious money back then. And its cultural impact, huge. By 1997, it's on a postage stamp. But what I find really fascinating digging back into it is how ambiguous it deliberately is. Like, is Larry Talbot really turned into a werewolf, or is it all in his head?
A delusion. That ambiguity was absolutely intentional. You can see it in the script. The screenwriter, Kurt Siodmak, who was a German Jew who'd fled the Nazis, which is important context, he actually capitalized the word legend in the opening encyclopedia entry. Lycanthropy, werewolfism. It's presented as a legend. The film's about people who believe in it, not necessarily proving the myth itself.
And the movie shows that so cleverly. That first attack scene, when Larry steps in, we see a wolf attacking Gwen's friend.
Yeah.
Right. But then, just for a split second, you see Bela Lugosi as the man, Bela the fortune teller, before it cuts back to the wolf. It strongly suggests, doesn't it, that maybe Larry's mind is merging these images, influenced by the village lore and the trauma.
And think about his first supposed kill as the wolf. There are no witnesses. And the animal tracks he thinks he sees the next morning, they conveniently vanish, poof, gone by the time anyone else could see them.
Yeah, and notice Larry only appears as the Wolfman in these very isolated one-on-one encounters. The victims, they never actually confirm seeing a transformation. They don't scream werewolf or anything like that. The screenplay even says multiple times something like, most anything can happen to a man in his own mind. It keeps hitting that note.
Right. And Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance is just iconic, isn't it? Even though the makeup by Jack Pierce must have been incredibly uncomfortable. All that yak hair, the prosthetics, the fangs, that underbite.
Oh, yeah. Pierce was a master, though. Using those dissolves and time-lapse shots for the transformations, they're still unsettling today. But the really deep stuff in this film, I think, comes from the things Siodmak just made up.
Yeah.
Things we now think are ancient werewolf rules.
Yes. This is where it gets incredibly powerful, especially knowing Siodmak's background. He invented several key bits of werewolf lore. The idea that a bite spreads the curse, that was him. He borrowed it from vampire stories, the weakness to silver, also Siodmak, again, inspired by other monster weaknesses.
And the pentagram.
Yeah.
The mark on the victims.
Exactly. That was his direct parallel to how the Nazis marked Jews. It's chilling when you realize that. He was embedding his own experience, his own trauma, right into the fabric of the myth.
So much of what we just accept as ancient werewolf tradition was actually a very modern, very poignant invention, a kind of veiled commentary. And that famous poem, of course, even a man who is pure in heart. We all quote that like it's from some medieval text.
That's amazing how that happens, isn't it? How quickly something new can feel ancient. But, Hollywood being Hollywood, Universal wanted a clear monster they could build a franchise around. So the sequels, like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman or Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, they pretty much dropped all that ambiguity. Larry became just, a straight-up monster, which kind of lost something from the original, I think.
It definitely did. And that brings us kind of full circle, right, to the new Wolfman film coming out in 2025 from Blumhouse. They seem to be drawing parallels to their Invisible Man remake from 2020, suggesting maybe a similar allegorical take.
Absolutely. It looks like this new one is leaning into very contemporary themes, things like male toxicity and uncontrollable violence,
Mhm.
and also generational trauma and disease, which is really interesting.
Yeah, the idea that the transformation isn't just changing, but maybe it's like dying, that the character is losing yourself. That ties into the disease idea, doesn't it?
It does. And apparently, much like the 41 film, this one's also playing with ambiguity, especially the ending. Is the beast trying to communicate something? Or maybe forcing a kind of mercy killing? It sounds like they're leaving it open for us to interpret.
It really shows how the myth keeps shifting, reflecting whatever's going on in society right now.
It certainly does. And speaking of shifting, it's just wild how far back this myth actually goes. Way, way before Hollywood. The name itself, lycanthropy, comes from the Greek lykos for wolf. Right.
Right. And one of the earliest sort of Western werewolf figures is King Lycaon from Greek myth. Ovid tells his story in the Metamorphoses. His transformation wasn't random. It was punishment from Zeus for, well, being incredibly immoral, serving human flesh, no less. It was a moral tale.
Mm-hmm. And we even have historical accounts, like Herodotus writing about the Naramaye people in Scythia. He said they turned into wolves for a few days each year. Though, to be fair, Herodotus himself was like, I don't really buy this story, even as he reported it. He said something like, personally, I am unconvinced, but they insist upon it and will swear to it.
It's amazing to think that back in the classical age, for many people, werewolves were probably considered as real as, say, a horse. The belief was widespread, maybe even more so than in the Middle Ages sometimes.
That's a good point. By medieval times in Europe, yeah, belief was still common, but religion started to shape the lore differently. In Anglo-Saxon England, the term werewolf was sometimes used literally as a synonym for the devil in legal texts from King Canut's time. And in other versions, they were sorcerers, people who used magic to transform.
So just like we saw with the Wolfman films adapting over time, the meaning of the werewolf itself keeps changing. You mentioned the Twilight era where monsters got all humanized and romantic. And back in the 80s, horror movies often used werewolves to talk about things like puberty or losing control, moral failing.
Right. The creature often becomes this sort of stand-in, a metaphor for the beast's call to the darkest parts of humanity, or sometimes a symbol for a serial killer or a tyrant figure who consumes people. It taps into those deep fears about losing control, about predatory behavior. Even during the Romantic Revival, you see the myth adapting again. Folklorists were either trying to record it scientifically or sometimes kind of polishing it up to make it more appealing. It just keeps finding ways to stay relevant.
Which brings us to a really different kind of Wolfman. Not mythical, not cinematic, but a real person. Sergei Pankachev, one of Sigmund Freud's most analyzed, most famous patients.
Ah, yes, the Wolfman case. Freud analyzed him from, 1910 to 1914, and then again for a bit later on. It became absolutely foundational for psychoanalysis. Serge, as he was known, came to Freud with this whole cluster of symptoms: childhood nightmares, really intense ones dominated by wolves, plus phobias, chronic constipation, which sounds odd but was significant, and this kind of obsessive thinking. And it all got much worse after a really bad bout of gonorrhea and its treatment.
Wow. And Freud's goal with the case was?
Well, Freud used it to try and prove his theories about libidinal drives, our basic unconscious desires, often sexual, and how they shape neuroses. Specifically, he focused on the idea of the primal scene, the child supposedly witnessing their parents having sex, though that part became very controversial later on.
Looking into Serge's early life, you can see where some struggles might have started. His parents sound quite neglectful. His mother often unwell. His father described as morose, prone to depression. He had an affectionate nanny early on, but then this English governess arrived, who he described as silly and cantankerous.
Right, and he himself said his personality changed after she came. He became discontented, irritable, constantly flying into a passion.
And the wolf thing,
Yeah.
he connected it partly to a picture book, where a wolf was stepping out, which terrified him. But also, really significantly, to his older sister Anna, teasing him with a Little Red Riding Hood picture, the wolf about to eat her grandmother.
Yeah, he remembered being furious, but maybe as much at his sister's teasing as at the wolf itself. Sibling dynamics.
Absolutely. And he even remembered drawing horses that always ended up looking like wolves or dogs, no matter what, which might connect to the sheepdogs on their family estate, where there was also that awful incident with the sheep dying from bad serum. A lot of animal-related stuff
Yeah.
in his childhood.
And then there was a big upheaval when he was 5. The family moved from their country estate, Dubieki Manor. Apparently, some people in Ukraine now call it the Wolf Lair. Interestingly, to the city Odessa. He felt cut off from nature, and his father later regretted selling it, which coincided with his own first depressive episode. Lots of loss there.
And more loss followed. His sister, Anna, she struggled a lot with feeling inadequate, thinking men would only want her for her money. She eventually died by suicide, taking mercury poison. Just tragic.
Terribly tragic. And Serge's own relationships were deeply troubled, too. He pursued a nurse, Therese, he met at a sanatorium. When she initially rejected him, he fell into such a severe depression, he attempted suicide with sleeping pills.
And his description of depression, it's fascinating how he talks about narcissism in that context.
Yeah.
Life feeling empty, people seeming like wax figures or wound up marionettes, like he couldn't connect, like there was a veil between him and reality. That really paints a picture of profound isolation.
It really does. Later, after his father died, he went back to Therese. But then things flipped. He became hesitant while she, now struggling financially with a daughter, wanted to marry. They did eventually marry, navigating difficulties during World War I because of anti-Russian feelings. But the tragedy continued. Therese later died by suicide too, using gas in Nazi Austria. Her suicide notes were vague, apparently, leaving Serge wondering if she was afraid of being discovered as Jewish or maybe had an illness she was hiding. Just layer upon layer of trauma.
And if that wasn't enough, there was his relationship with another woman, Louise. For 25 years, he called it a terrible affair with an impossible woman. And the description sounds like a classic abusive cycle.
Yeah, her impulsiveness, constant blaming, slandering him, always feeling like the victim, making wild demands, threatening to expose him. And Serge felt trapped. He couldn't leave, partly because he felt obligated, she was ill, had no money. It sounds incredibly draining and toxic.
So with all this complexity in his life, how solid was Freud's interpretation of it all? That's the big question, isn't it?
Exactly. And later analysts really criticized Freud's handling of the case. Accusations of paternalistic bias, meaning he kind of imposed his own views, of minimizing the maternal transference, the feelings Serge projected onto Freud from his relationship with his mother. Critics also felt Freud maybe downplayed aggression, focusing too much on the sexual side.
Right. And the whole primal scene idea, did anyone really buy that?
Well, many questioned how realistic it was. Aristocratic kids like Serge probably slept in the nursery with their nannies, not where they could witness that.
Even Serge himself wasn't fully convinced, was he?
No, he called Freud a genius, but also said much isn't true. He thought the primal scene was likely a construct, something Freud kind of built. He believed his own problems were more innate, like he was born with something like that. He was quite skeptical.
And he had issues with the idea of transference, too.
Yeah, he thought it could be dangerous, leading people to just blindly believe whatever their therapist said. He even apparently scoffed when a later analyst, Ruth Mack Brunswick, made some claim about his masturbation habits, basically saying it was nonsense because he was with Therese at the time. He wasn't afraid to push back.
It really highlights the tricky ethics of psychoanalysis, doesn't it? Especially the power dynamic, that parental transference where the therapist becomes like a parent figure.
Absolutely. And there was the whole Frink fiasco, where Freud advised another patient, Horst Frink, to divorce his wife and marry another patient, which ended very badly for Frink's mental health and led to accusations against Freud. It shows how therapist suggestions can go wrong.
Okay, but there were other theories about Serge's wolf dream, right, besides Freud's?
Yes. What's really fascinating here is the work of Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok. They use this method called cryptonomy, analyzing words and their hidden meanings, almost like cracking a code. They theorized the wolf dream wasn't about the primal scene, but was actually a buried memory, a crypt, hiding something else entirely.
Hiding what?
Their theory was that it hid the trauma of his father sexually abusing his sister, Anna, possibly with the governess blackmailing them. This hidden shame, this false self, built around the secret, they argued, was what prevented Serge from ever truly recovering.
Wow, that's a very different interpretation. Darker, in a way.
It is. And they also suggested his inability to remember parts of his childhood or discuss big political things like the rise of the Nazis, that this might reflect an incorporated trauma related to the Russian Revolution. His whole identity as a wealthy Russian aristocrat had become unspeakable due to history. It suggests trauma can be absorbed almost unconsciously from historical events.
Incredible. From the depths of one man's psyche. Let's shift to the medical world now. Clinical lycanthropy. This is a real diagnosis.
It is, though it's very rare. It's classified as a delusional misidentification syndrome. Patients genuinely believe they are transforming or have already transformed into an animal.
Not just wolves, though.
No, not at all. There are cases involving cats, birds, horses, tigers, pretty much any animal, really. It's often linked with other conditions, psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, severe depression, or bipolar disorder, sometimes drug intoxication, brain injuries, dementia, even seizures can trigger it.
So what do doctors think is actually happening in the brain?
Well, the theories often point to some kind of physical imbalance, maybe in the parts of the cerebral cortex that manage our sense of body shape and perception. It might create feelings similar to phantom limbs, but for, paws or wings or fur that aren't there.
But we don't fully understand it yet.
Not fully, no. Neuroscience is still figuring it out. And what's also interesting is how culture seems to shape the specifics of the delusion. How it presents clinically can vary depending on whether you're in a Western culture or Asian, African, Indian.
And treatment. What helps?
It's usually a combination approach. Antipsychotic medications are often key, sometimes SSRIs for mood symptoms, plus psychotherapy like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and support groups can be really important too.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From the movies to ancient myths, Freud's couch, to modern medicine. When you pull all these threads together, the cinematic werewolf as maybe inner madness, the myth as a moral warning or primal fear, the Wolfman case showing deep trauma and history's impact, clinical lycanthropy showing the brain's strange pathways. What's the common howl here? What ties it all together?
I think the werewolf consistently across all these different contexts forces us to look at the duality in all of us. That's the core, isn't it? That struggle between our human side and what we perceive as our bestial nature, our impulses, our anger, our desires, the consequences when those urges feel uncontrollable. It's a very powerful mirror.
Yeah, and thinking about René Girard's ideas
Mm.
about how society sometimes need to vent anger or dehumanize others, the idea of the monster, like the werewolf, can become this kind of outlet, right? Makes it easier to point fingers at scapegoats, at external enemies, instead of looking at the conflicts inside ourselves or our own groups.
Spot on. It avoids the harder work of introspection. Ultimately, the werewolf myth, in all its forms, seems to constantly circle back to the idea of self-control. The importance of understanding those inner urges, acknowledging them, rather than just letting them fester under the surface, waiting to break out.
So, from those ancient kings cursed by gods to Lon Chaney Jr. under the movie lights, to the intimate pain of Sergei Pankachev and the baffling reality of clinical lycanthropy, the werewolf myth just keeps echoing, doesn't it? Offering these profound, sometimes uncomfortable insights into what it means to be human. It really reminds you that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't out there in the dark woods. They're inside our own complex minds.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for you listening. As you think about all these layers of the werewolf story, consider this. What hidden beasts, what unresolved conflicts might be lurking in your own inner world, waiting for you to acknowledge them, understand them, and maybe even learn to tame them?